in this project that really was inspired by a conversation after going to the gym and then sitting at the bar together. So this great ideas are hatched when you exercise and then also play hard. And we were sitting together at a bar called London Underground in downtown Ames, Iowa, and we were talking about our fields and how we could work together. And she was talking about this program called the ISU for You Promise. So the ISU for You Promise is a guarantee from Iowa State University to 2 schools in downtown Des Moines. So there are 2 schools in downtown Des Moines, King and Moulton Elementary Schools, that are the most underserved, most culturally and racially diverse schools in Iowa, and they're also the most impoverished. And ISU made a promise that if kids that went to those 2 elementary schools ended up making it all the way through and successfully graduating from school in the Des Moines public school system, they would have guaranteed tuition according to the number of years they spent at one of those elementary schools. So if they went for 5 years to elementary school at King or Moulton, their entire undergraduate tuition could be paid for. So it's a really great program. But the challenge then is to make sure that the kids are actually college ready. They have to be college ready, and they have to meet the admission standards at Iowa State in order to go there. So Catherine had worked really diligently to develop a variety of different programs to work toward that college readiness. And one of the things that seemed egregiously missing was science and curricula that speak to the needs of curious young minds to become scientists. And so she and I were talking about this, the promise, and we talked about the idea that we could take some outreach programs from my lab. I was at Iowa State University. We could take some outreach to after school programming. I could bring mosquitoes and pipettes, and kids would love it, and it would be fun. And then a couple of days later, a call for proposals came into our inboxes from the NIH. And NIH actually has a really well-funded scientific education program. So the scientific education partnerships are the NIH sort of, we always think of NSF as funding K through 12 programming, but NIH does it too. And so this call for proposals for a scientific education partnership came through, and Katie and I thought, those ideas we were talking about the other night really could easily fuel a grant proposal. And so we came up with this idea. As a side note, I think it would be really fun to try and track how many great ideas come out of a night at the terrace. Like $1 million ideas are hatched. And that's what this was. This was $1 million idea, $1.3 million idea that we came up with. So the idea combines her expertise in training undergraduate scholars who are going to become teachers, and her expertise in multicultural education and diversity pedagogy, and then what I can bring to the table as a medical entomologist. So I'm going to explain this to you in greater detail. This is some demographic information from one of the schools. These data are a couple of years old, but the facts still are very similar. So Moulton Elementary School is a school with 500 students. 39% of them are enrolled in additional English language learning. So a lot of kids are coming from backgrounds where their families didn't speak English as a first language. 94% of the kids receive or need free or fee-reduced lunch, and so all the kids just eat for free. And 14% of students have an individualized education program. So there's a lot of deep need for additional support for these students. Their families speak a variety of different languages, so there's a list over there of languages spoken in their homes, including Vietnamese, Nepalese, Somali, etc. The neighborhood has a median age of 25, so they tend to be very young families with very low incomes, so the income median is $32,000. And so you can see that the challenge at the right is that only 48% of those students are proficient in math, 50% proficient in reading, and 46% proficient in science. So they need additional support in order to get to be college ready, right? So that was kind of the laying the groundwork for the work that we began to do. So we had these two schools, and then the two schools are really served by a community organization called Foom, the Children and Family Urban Movement Program. This was actually started by a Black Panther who became a senator in Iowa, and he really pushed the idea that kids need breakfast in order to succeed at school. So they started Foom as a way of making sure that kids had a healthy breakfast and got off to school and got started. And then it became also an after-school program, and it's really a community landing space. So the kids rely on Foom for all kinds of things. Many of them go there after school. Many of them are served all summer long by Foom programming at very reduced rates, so it's really affordable. And it's all housed in this beautiful ancient Methodist church that's in Des Moines, and they're very, very welcoming of all kinds of people. And so with those two schools and this community organization and Iowa State University's promise, we could really make a cogent argument to the National Institutes of Health that we could access and touch lives in a really special way by developing this concept of young scientists and ambitious teachers improving health in an urban ecosystem. And so, of course, as all grants do, we had several specific aims, but the overall objective was to promote authentic science, ambitious teaching, and an orientation to science pursuits. So the other background information that I should tell you is that the pre-service teachers, so those are students that are learning to be K through 12 teachers, the pre-service teachers at Iowa State University and at many universities in the Midwest are predominantly white women. So like 95% of them are white women. And few of them are non-white, and few of them obviously are male. So there is a demographic of people who are learning to be elementary educators or middle school educators who have really not seen the kinds of things that I explained to you a couple of slides ago. So they haven't come from the same school system. And so Catherine Richardson Bruno's work is to bring them a multicultural education perspective and teach them about diversity pedagogy and get them into classrooms where they can see the wonders that kids from around the world bring to the classroom. So that's part of it, and those students we find are generally quite science averse. So they're women mostly, and they're women who don't think of themselves as scientists, and not very many of them take a science track. And so not only were we wanting to take science to kids in classrooms, but we were wanting the young teachers to also see themselves as scientists. What we know about kids and their development is that they're most curious and most oriented towards science in elementary school, and then their interest precipitously drops off if there isn't an inspiring teacher. And so if you have a whole bunch of teachers who don't identify as scientists, then you could really easily lose that catch. There also are a lot of data to show that the interest precipitously drops off more for people of color than for other groups, for Asian and white students. So, so there's a distinct need to make sure that the kids understand themselves as scientists and that the teachers also can do that too. So, so we wanted to develop this program, and people will often say, well, why would you do this with mosquitoes? But I think actually mosquitoes are a really beautiful way to segue into science education and learning, because everybody has a mosquito story. Whether you're repulsed by them, which is most people, or fascinated by them, like Mitchell and I, then you have some connection to a mosquito experience. Perhaps they bother you in your backyard, maybe they've transmitted an infectious disease to you, etc. They're really a gateway topic. And this is from a colleague of mine at Rutgers who said this at an entomology meeting, and I truly believe that's true. So what we did was we developed a concept that is Mosquitoes and Me Summer Camp. So our idea was to go and work with that community organization and those kids and the pre-service teachers, all in an experience where they would come together for a 2-week summer camp. We put the summer camp into the high school where the kids would go, so that they would feel like some connection to that space once they get to high school. So we orient them to the space in North High School. This last year we worked in a middle school. These are places where the kids ultimately will be, and they can build confidence being there. We work with children and family urban movement to recruit kids and families to participate. We go to the school and we spend 2 weeks learning mosquito science. But our approach to science teaching is very different from the collegiate experience, right? So as a professor, I teach parasitology to undergrads. And it's largely didactic, right? So I stand up and I tell silly stories and I pontificate about parasitic life cycles, and it's the typical university experience. That won't work to draw in kids who are 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders, right? So we decided to take a new approach, a new sort of teaching approach that is being developed by colleagues at the University of Washington. The idea is called ambitious science teaching. So with ambitious science teaching, rather than me standing up and talking about something and explaining, for example, a mosquito life cycle, we show the kids a phenomenon, and then we put them in small groups and they have a discussion about it, and they can ask questions and use tools and ask questions and ask more questions, and the teachers are supposed to guide them in an inquisition of that material. And so then what happens is the kids, in theory, using ambitious science teaching, have a really different experience where they, in the end, own what they've learned in a very different way than if I had just told them everything straight up. So that's the idea. And what would happen is that for the duration of our 2-week summer camp, of course, we had to come up with a lesson plan, which I never do as a college level teacher. So we had to come up with lesson plans and curricula and do all kinds of things that were really outside of my comfort zone and really fascinating to do. And so we worked with these pre-service teachers, and we taught them this way of teaching science, and they came up with lessons that they would implement at summer camp. So they got this really phenomenal experience as teachers that they don't get as just teachers that go in and visit classrooms and observe. They really led lessons. And then I had to come up with all kinds of lessons, and most days we were just winging it and figuring it out as we went because we had a whole room of kids. And so what you can see here is a typical day. This was June 22nd, 2018. The kids would get picked up, they'd show up, we would feed them breakfast, and then we do something called Harambe. So after breakfast, we all join in a circle and we sing a Swahili song called Harambe, and there are different words over time, but essentially what it's about is learning together and being together in community. So we do the Harambe, and then we do recognitions. And so from days previous, the kids would think about things that were impactful for them, and they would recognize the person that affected that. So Mr. Mitchell did this, and he was recognized for, I can't remember what were you recognized for, Mitchell, do you remember? For helping a particular student. And then, so the student would say, Mr. Mitchell helped me do this. And then everybody claps, and we all make fireworks, and everybody's hearts are warmed by the child being brave enough to say out loud this affirmation, and then the person receiving it is also, of course, really grateful for that experience. And so it's a really nice way to start the day. So it grounds us in community right from the start. And then we would do some kind of mosquito learning, and in this case, this was a lesson about water quality and amount. So we had a pre-service teacher who had been walking down the street and saw a discarded ketchup thing from McDonald's, and she saw water in it, and she thought, oh, I wonder if a mosquito could survive in that. And so she designed a whole lesson around this idea of how much water is enough, and kind of what water quality is essential for the mosquito to survive. And then she had to show that to the students, and they had to look at it and think about it, and over several days collect data and learn more and more about mosquito biology as a result. Then of course we have lunch, and we feed the kids hopefully food that they like, and then we go outside. And then we come back in, and in this day we were playing Lyrics Lab and probing with Paul, so I dissected mosquitoes for them. And then we did a neighborhood walk, and they thought about where there are spaces in their neighborhoods that mosquitoes might be. And then we had them do a map experiment. In some cases we had them use GPS, or we had them just draw their house, and then they go back. And it flies by, and they get all of these intensive immersive experiences. And then, of course, we make notes about what we should do different next time. And so every summer, the experience has gotten, I think, more and more enriching for everybody. So some of the things that we want to do are nurture science identities. So we don't want the kids to only see a scientist as, a 60-year-old white man in a chemistry lab with beakers with colored solutions. And so if you ask kids this age, who do they immediately think of as a scientist, often the answer is Albert Einstein. So we want them to understand themselves as scientists. This is a primary goal. Like, see yourself as a curious being who's interested in learning more, and understand that that alone makes you a scientist in my mind. It's really anchored in curiosity. Then we want them to see scientists of different kinds. And so this scientist is a gentleman who worked for me at Iowa State for 8 years, and he's an actor, and he calls himself an actor and a culicidologist. So he identifies as somebody who studies mosquitoes and is also an actor, and he doesn't look like Albert Einstein. So we had him there. This is a student, Hari, who's working on the Mosquito Buzz project at Stanford. She piped in by Zoom one day and told us about the work she's doing to identify mosquitoes just based on wing beat sounds using a cell phone. So she's developed this technology where you can stick your phone into a Ziploc bag with a mosquito in it and record the mosquito wing beats, and she can tell you potentially what species is there.
Can I just ask,
Yeah.
is it just by genus, or can you actually, within a genus, identify species?
Yeah, so they claim to be able to identify a species. But I think it would be really great with the kids so this is mostly like anophelines from Africa, so several anopheles species they can identify this way. With the kids, what I want to do is explore more of the species that would be in the upper Midwest. Some of the 50 species that are in Iowa, for example, 55 species of Iowa, and see really what the sort of fidelity of that assay is, right? How sensitive and specific is it?
We'll follow up later, but there's a new faculty member here on acoustic ecology.
Oh, great. Yeah, very cool. Yes, we've put a lot of microphones near mosquitoes to play around with that idea, so I would love to meet that person. All right, so scientists look like all kinds of different things. We want them to see themselves as scientists. We give them gear so that they build community as mosquito scientists. So this year, those students got Skeeter Scientists shirts. That next year, they got Mosquitoes and Me shirts. We give them authentic science tools. So you can see in this last image, they get pipettes, turkey basters. This year we had this amazing conversation that evolved about science tools and then science duals, so like dual purpose things that can be used for science, like a turkey baster, which can be used to baste a turkey or to suck up mosquito larvae from a little pool in the grass at Living History Farms. So that's it's really amazing to watch things happen. We give the kids a science notebook and send them on a field trip, and they become friends. They get really excited about finding mosquitoes. They record data, all kinds of things that teachers in classrooms would never get to see or know about these kids. We give them authentic science tools. So this young man is working with a 100 microliter pipette. This guy's working with some phase microscopy to see parasite specimens. Genevieve has a tissue culture flask in her hand, so Anybody who works in a lab, if you have expired tissue culture flasks, I take them and work with the kids with them. So they go out and they sample and bring things back to the lab, and we identify them. They have, again, here's a young woman who's working with a pipette and a microscope. And Augustine here is working with a 5-gallon bucket full of stink water, which Haley makes all the time for her studies on mosquitoes. So this is an authentic science experience too. To trap the Culex mosquitoes that transmit West Nile virus, we brew up really horribly stinky water alongside Russell Labs in 5-gallon buckets and other containers. And that putrefying material that is in those buckets is just irresistible to a gravid mosquito, so she comes and lays her eggs there knowing that it's the perfect place for her little babies to develop. And so Augustine was brewing that up for me. And it becomes a really totally different kind of science learning, and we have really awesome footage of the students talking about the kind of learning they do. They say right out loud, like, this is nothing like school, and it's so amazing. And so they get a lot out of the kind of learning they're doing. Oftentimes they don't even realize they're learning, they're just playing and having fun. And so right now we're in the process of writing another NSF proposal to try and understand emotional connections and play and how that impacts how people learn. So connecting emotionally to material, certainly we know makes a profound difference in memory retention, but what else can it do? So we're going to buy oximeters and measure kids' pulse and body temperature and other things to see how they respond to learning experiences. This is an experiment that one of the pre-service teachers developed. So she was interested in what it is that mosquito larvae eat. And so she developed an experiment where she asked the kids to suggest what mosquito larvae might like to eat. And so she brought in response to their suggestions, a menagerie of different things. So she brought in yeast and saltines and broken up leaves and cereal and rabbit food. And then we had mortars and pestles for the kids, so they ground it up into fine material. And they took a hungry mosquito larva that I provided, looked at it with a microscope, and watched its little mandibles move and tested whether the mosquitoes like to eat those different things. And then their groups decided what mixture of things would be best. And they described the food item that they had given, and they had to collect data daily to say whether or not it was being consumed and what the water looked like as a result. So they collected data like the water looks really cloudy and brown, or the water looks clear and there's not much food left, and they'd feed the mosquitoes some more. And they had a control group, so we didn't call it that, but they had a group of mosquitoes that were being fed tetramin, which is what we feed them in the lab. So they would have, a parallel, so they could watch how their food stuff compared to what Ms. Lyric feeds them in the lab. Every day they collected the data, and this is another instance of an experience where the understanding and the literature would tell you that kids can't engage in science for more than 5 minutes. But we put these things out, and we give them all these authentic science tools and notebooks, and they're in it. You couldn't tear them away. I mean, some of them are less interested than others, but we often see that the kids flock to go collect their data, and they really are deliberate about writing in their lab notebooks, and they're thinking and talking with their fellow classmates and also with the teachers that are there with them. So in the end, we developed a luxurious larval menu, and the group that won the year that this was originally developed, they fed their mosquitoes Cinnamon Toast Crunch and Raisin Bran, and they developed better than the mosquitoes that were fed tetramin in the lab. So at the same time, in parallel, what we did was we asked the kids to bring in recipes from their parents and families. And so we had the Luscious Larva menu, and we had a whole cookbook of menus from these kids' homes, and we put that all together for them in the end so that they could take home a book of recipes that included the Licious larva menu. But all of those things help the kids understand all kinds of things, right? Like the parallels between us and other animals, helps to profoundly develop this sense that mosquitoes have value. It's really extraordinary how their perceptions change over the course of a couple of weeks. One of the things that we've done with kids is have them develop their own mosquito traps. So they learn all kinds of things about mosquito biology, and then we tell them, find enticing ways to tap into that mosquito biology. And so they've built these traps out of all kinds of recycled materials. And so this young man decided that the trap should be clear, but it should have a light in it, and I think there was festering yeasty water in the bottom. So he knew that light would attract a mosquito, and he had red tape on there as a blood source. So some of the kids soak cotton balls with sugar and honey. Ooh, the honey is really disgusting, and all kinds of red food coloring. And they go through bottles and bottles of honey and red food coloring, and they build a trap. And here's a trap that's just a plastic bottle. So what we had them do was build the trap, then explain why they had put all those components in, and talk about how the thing that they put in would attract a mosquito, and then put the traps out and see what happens when you take them out into the field. And so we deployed the traps. And so here, these young men are carrying this giant box that's full of honey and other things. And this young woman had a trap that had red-colored yeast water in it. And these guys attracted a whole bunch of ants, nothing else. And then, it's just like this big open box. So if a mosquito had flown in there, we would never know because it just flew away. But this young woman had put tape on the outside of her bottle, double-sided sticky tape, and she was the only kid that year that collected a mosquito, because the mosquito had probably oriented to the smell of gaseous emissions from the bottle and stuck to the tape. So they learn all kinds of things about engineering and construction, and they're putting to their knowledge to it's translational work, right? It's translational research. They're taking the knowledge they have and making some manifestation of that. Then they're supposed to get time to reconstruct them, but we always run out of time. So here's another example of a kind of thing we did. One time we did this activity where we had the kids think that they were themselves insects. So you can see that Emma has on a hat that says, I'm an insect, and she has antennae. And so the idea was to put yourself in the mind frame of being an insect, and you're looking at a human, and you're wondering, what are all those structures on that thing? And what are they for? Like we do if we're looking at an insect closely. What are all those things, and what do they do? So we had the kids draw themselves, and then draw a mosquito larva, and figure out all the structures and label all the structures. So they drew a face, and they drew a nose and eyes, and they had to label all those structures and explain what they're for. So why do you have eyes? Why do you have eyebrows? That one's always an interesting conversation. Why do you have eyelashes? And then we draw a mosquito larva. So they have microscopes, they can look at the larva, they draw, and they think about the analogous structures. So what's the same? So they find eyes on the mosquito larva, they find mouths and mouth parts, not quite teeth, and they find hairs, and they talk about what are those hairs for, just like what are your eyelashes for, right? So you sense information, and they draw all these other structures. Ultimately, they end up figuring out that it's the tail end of the mosquito larva that takes in oxygen. So mosquito larvae breathe through their butts, which is insanely funny when you're a 4th, 5th grader, or even when you're 43. So amazing biology, and all things are on the table. So we would, if a kid starts talking about bodily functions here that sometimes would be viewed as inappropriate in a classroom, like I've just said butt in front of you, right? We would not discourage a kid from talking about something if it wasn't, as long as it's not wildly inappropriate and it's biology based, we should have that conversation. We don't want them to shut up. We want them to keep talking, right? So very different from a traditional classroom. in this was totally ad hoc. This student, Jade, decided to have a conversation with the kids about whether mosquitoes are superheroes or supervillains. And so the kids started talking about superheroes and what are superhero traits of mosquitoes. And they decided that male mosquitoes aren't supervillains because they learned that male mosquitoes don't blood feed. They think, oh, well, they're superheroes because they pollinate flowers, which is true. And, they're just feeding their babies. And so Jade drew a mosquito feeding on a duck. And then supervillains because they inflict these itchy bites, they spread disease, and maybe it's just the females that are supervillains. So then they draw a mosquito comic. And that's actually evolved into this additional supplemental award that we've gotten from the NIH to actually work with Bob Hall, who's a Marvel Comics artist and writer. And Bob is helping us develop a whole comic book that's going to be called Mosquitoes Suck. And it's going to relate to the curriculum we've developed here. And we'll have place-based information in the book, so it'll be about the mosquitoes that impact kids in Iowa and hopefully also in Ecuador. And we'll have kids that are modeled after the kids that have been in our camp, so they'll actually, some of our students will actually see themselves in a comic book. Can you imagine how amazing that would be? And the idea is that we would work with this comic book artist and writer to make this information really accessible to a very broad audience. And ultimately, the goal of this camp for me, and of the comic book for me, and of Mosquitos Y Yo for me, is hopefully we have some impact on public health.